In early 1943, in a Marseille villa that had once hosted artists and diplomats, the knock came just after curfew. A coded phrase spoken at the door confirmed the visitor's identity. Inside, Nancy Wake, codename Haleen, listened as a British courier delivered a transmission schedule window, her last lifeline to London. Within weeks, the Gestapo would put her name at the top of its most wanted list. The villa, known as Villa Kristen, sat behind shuttered olive trees along the Boulevard Perrier, tucked among the fast-changing zones of a city increasingly controlled by German and Vichy security agents. Over the preceding 2 years, Wake had orchestrated courier routes, bribed officials, forged identities, and helped smuggle hundreds of downed Allied airmen and Jewish families across the border into Spain. But Marseille in 1943 was no longer the porous escape hub it had once been. Following increased collaboration between Vichy and the Abwehr, the Gestapo had added permanent field officers to the city, men like Karl Bermelberg, formerly based in Paris, now tasked with eliminating all known escape networks. The courier who arrived that night at Villa Kristen had been ferried from the demilitarized zone through a chain of station drops. He carried a wax-sealed cylinder containing a one-time pad encoding strip and a revised transmission window, from 0350 to 0405, operating on a narrow band intended to minimize detection by German DF units. Wake's job would be to pass it on to one of 3 wireless operators in the region, all of whom were operating under constantly shifting call signs. The signals had to align precisely with SOE's London station XV. A single missed window would sever supply links, airdrop coordination, and sabotage scheduling. She burned the courier's previous passphrases in a ceramic ashtray behind the fireplace immediately after the exchange. There was no ceremony. The silence of the act underscored the weight of what was unfolding. Wake knew there were now informants even among housekeeping staff, Vichy sympathizers recruited for tips in exchange for ration coupons. Rooms were swept weekly for microphones. Phones were considered penetrated. Each meeting was time-bound, tracked, and then instantly disavowed. It was at Villa Kristen that Nancy Wake crossed the final line between resistance organizer and embedded SOE asset, no longer just a French liaison, but a field operative operating under British command structure. Within 6 weeks, German field reports would describe her only by an alias, the White Mouse. Born in New Zealand and raised in Australia, Nancy Wake began her Paris life as a freelance reporter. Her dispatches from Vienna and early Nazi rallies exposed her to the regime's rising brutality. By 1939, her transformation had already begun, from observer to participant, from byline to contact courier. In 1933, Wake traveled to Vienna on assignment. There, she witnessed firsthand the beating of Jewish civilians by uniformed thugs in the street, an experience that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Her early journalism brought her close to fascist ideology long before most Britons or Australians understood its implications. She filed pieces for major Hearst agencies and gained a reputation in the Paris press circuit as ambitious, self-directed, and unusually clear-eyed about the direction Europe was heading. But after Germany's Anschluss in 1938 and the fall of Czechoslovakia in 1939, journalism alone no longer felt sufficient. When France declared war that September, Wake volunteered as an ambulance driver. The front never came to Paris directly, but the unfolding defeats of 1940, including the German breakthrough at Sedan and the collapse of the French defense at Dunkirk, forced a reckoning. By June, Marshal Pétain had signed the armistice. Wake, living in Marseille, found herself inside a nominally unoccupied zone governed by Vichy, but already entangled with German intelligence efforts. As the Wehrmacht advanced, Wake began working informally with escape networks. Her French husband, Henri Fiacca, operated in Marseille's business elite, which gave him access to shipping documents, regional passport endorsements, and police routines. Using this infrastructure, The couple began sheltering soldiers and resistance contacts. Nancy built out her network cautiously. At first, she carried messages between safe houses. Then she began escorting fugitives herself, posing as a nurse, governess, or secretary on unguarded backroads to Perpignan or Dax. The first route she ran used municipal rail links and forged Red Cross permits. She memorized fares, officer uniforms, checkpoint codes. Her Australian accent, an anomaly in southern France, became an unexpected advantage. German officers often mistook her for a diplomatic staffer or neutral expatriate. This allowed her to blend into unconventional spaces: hospital wings, postal staging areas, administrative corridors. By the end of 1941, Wake had helped over 200 individuals evade capture. She carried no weapon, yet she had already entered the war zone, armed with only false names, local contacts, and the increasing knowledge that the Gestapo had begun asking about women with foreign accents near Marseille. Following the fall of France in June 1940, Wake and her husband, industrialist Henry Fiacca, used his business cover to support early escape lines. Their flat on Rue Grignan became a listening post and transit hub. Through bribes, bicycle routes, and false documents, they helped dozens of Allied airmen escape Vichy control. Marseille, technically within the Vichy-administered free zone, was far from free in practice. German intelligence operatives moved openly through the streets by late 1940, and the milice, the paramilitary police loyal to the Vichy regime, closely monitored movement through the ports and rail stations. The city became both a bottleneck and a doorway. It was here that Allied fugitives and stranded resistance members converged, looking for false papers and passage south to Spain or north, toward clandestine operations in Lyon. Wake quickly adapted to the city's new geography. Offices that were loyal in the morning could be raided by nightfall. The Rue Grignan flat, outwardly part of Henry Fiacca's import-export network, operated under strict routines. They kept 3 identity kits within the apartment, each prefab set matching a backstory, city of birth, and work sponsor. Wake filtered fugitives through a network of sympathetic priests, hotel clerks, and postal unionists. One standard route took travelers from Marseille to Narbonne on the PLM rail line, disguised as clerks or farm laborers under Vichy agricultural exemption codes. A bicycle loaded with bread bags often held secondary documents or contacts names written in lemon juice between newsprint columns. Nancy's operational responsibilities grew with each passing month. She was the one who taught escapees which checkpoint officers demanded cash in francs versus gold watches, which conductors turned a blind eye, and which cafe owners used checked tablecloths to signal when the Gestapo had been through. When betrayals occurred, and they did, particularly after raids on the Polish networks in early 1941, Wake organized new routes overnight. One sector of the flat was converted into a crude archive hidden behind a false cabinet. It held carbon paper rubbings, transit maps, cutter blades, and switch cases used to mimic postal stamps. Wake's fluency in French, understanding of rail schedules, and social mobility made her a central figure not only in local evasion work, but in the entire Allied underground corridor linking France to neutral Spain. By late 1941, the name Hailing was circulating in German field files, not yet with a photograph, but attached to escape reports they couldn't explain. As the occupation deepened, Marseille's port became a surveillance zone. Shipping manifests, dockworker uniforms, and passenger papers came under Gestapo control. Wake adjusted her tactics, moving messages through household servants and signal codes disguised in domestic routines. By mid-1942, the pace of arrests in the city had accelerated. The Abwehr and Gestapo had established permanent offices on Rue Paradis and commandeered floors in the Hôtel du Louvre et de la Paix, once a haunt of diplomats, now a black site for overnight interrogations. The docks, once lively with merchant crews from across the Mediterranean, had become a grid of controlled checkpoints. Freight arriving from Algiers or Casablanca was offloaded under the inspection of armed guards. Port clearance required stamps from at least two stacked authorities, the Vichy Customs Office and a German Naval Liaison Bureau staffed with field police. Nancy Wake could no longer rely on outbound shipping cables or bribable dock clerks to move information. The old system, using coded notes slipped into bicycle baskets left unchained beside the Rue Saint-Post depot, had become too risky. One runner was picked up after a routine ID check led to a pat-down that discovered a cigarette case double-lined with carbon paper and cipher fragments. He never returned. To adapt, Wake decentralized her network. Maids carried washing baskets lined with courier drops. One woman, employed at a home Wake never visited, would nod twice at a bakery counter if the next house on the chain had been hit. Wake devised a set of gestures and timings disguised as household discussion. A missing jar of jam on a windowsill indicated a surveillance tail. A handkerchief tucked in a coat pocket at mid-morning meant the safe house at Castlane was still operating. Her most critical courier line, connecting Marseille to Toulouse, now ran entirely through nondescript women posing as domestic workers. One 18-year-old laundress memorized entire routing sequences and drop addresses, traveling with nothing on her person but a ration book. German checkpoint guards rarely searched women with working-class French identity cards, especially if they moved with practiced fatigue. The Gestapo's tightening grip only served to sharpen Wake's operational discipline. She didn't meet couriers in person unless absolutely necessary, and she documented only what could be committed to memory in 60 seconds. The city still functioned on paper, mails, stamps, and schedules, but every page now had to lie for the truth to move. By late 1941, Nancy Wake was using forged papers under the codename Hailing. Her ability to navigate checkpoints, improvise identities, and switch dialects led SOE recruiters to refer to her as the White Mouse. She earned the moniker due to the Gestapo's inability to trap or trace her. The papers identified her as Lucien Dumont, a traveling cosmetics saleswoman from Nice. In reality, they were the product of a deep forgery lab operated out of a hotel laundry basement near Brive-la-Gaillarde, one of several document ring outposts feeding the shrinking window of safe passage across unoccupied France. The documents included not only her false identity card but supporting artifacts, ration coupons with appropriate issue serials, a dog-eared membership slip for the French Women's League, a bookkeeping ledger marked with forged sales visits to clients who no longer existed. Wake adjusted her appearance for each ID cycle. Her blonde hair was a disadvantage in some areas, drawing unwanted attention when traveling through rural regions under heightened patrol after sabotage events. At times, she wore dark dye or heavy wool turbans to blend among Catholic housekeeping staff. In German-secured areas, she shifted to tailored skirts and polished shoes, matching the expected attire of Vichy sympathizers or departmental secretaries. Her accent, though Australian in origin, could pass as Southern French, Toulouse-born, if she spoke quickly and avoided hard consonants, a skill she refined during interrogations at Vichy checkpoints. Her reputation for quick improvisation became legendary within Allied circles. In one instance, near Aix-en-Provence, she recognized a customs officer who had seen her under a different alias 4 weeks earlier. She collided deliberately with a vegetable cart, feigning injury, and diverted attention long enough to slip onto a departing tram. The cart had been placed there precisely for such contingencies. It was one of several diversionary tactics coordinated with other escape line handlers who worked from produce stalls, mechanics' garages, and even a funeral supply distributor near St. Charles Station. By the winter of 1942, German intelligence files in Lyon and Marseille referenced the same figure. A woman escorting Allied airmen and political targets through rail corridors and side roads. No name but several aliases. No photo, but increasingly detailed notes about clothing, height, and timing patterns. The codename Hailing had begun to circulate across SOE dispatch logs and in Gestapo situation briefings under a separate label. The White Mouse remains unlocated. Faced with imminent arrest, Wake attempted a winter crossing of the Pyrenees in December 1942. The journey took her over icy passes in worn boots, guided by smugglers fluent in silence and mistrust. Her capture by Spanish patrols led to interrogation, but not exposure. By late autumn, the Gestapo had intensified its operations in Marseille, sweeping known networks and conducting home-by-home arrests. Several of Wake's contacts had disappeared after raids near Parc Chanot. Files recovered from the SD's Marseille field office later confirmed that Wake's alias Hailing had been matched to preliminary sketches circulated by informants. Her safe houses were no longer safe. On December 12, a coded message from an SOE relay station in Lyon reached her through a courier: flee or face arrest within 72 hours. She joined a small group of resistance couriers and stranded airmen on a pre-planned escape route into Spain. The groupement de passage, composed of Basque smugglers and Republican exiles, arranged the crossing. They gathered at dusk near St. Girons, equipped with boiled wool blankets, hard bread, and false Red Cross papers. The smugglers provided no names, only rules: no lights, no noise, no stopping. The ascent began at night under a waxing moon, through snow that reached above the knees, over trails used for centuries by shepherds and fugitives. Wake wore civilian clothes under an overcoat not suited for alpine exposure. The cold bit through worn soles and numbed her hands, but the greater danger was height, not from nature, but from the German patrols who now swept the foothills regularly, supported by dogs and mountain troops trained on the Eastern Front. At one point, a guide paused the group in silence for nearly 2 hours as a German ski detachment passed less than 400 meters downslope. They cleared the French frontier just beyond Col de la Cour, but Spanish Guardia Civil patrols intercepted them near Esteridano. Wake was held for several days in a municipal facility in Lleida. Conditions were harsh, but her forged documents and composure under questioning prevented identification. According to British consular records recovered post-war, she was presented as a stranded social worker displaced by the Allied invasion of North Africa. Her release, negotiated by neutral diplomatic channels tied to SOE intermediaries, was finalized in early January 1943. The mountains had not claimed her, and neither had the Gestapo. But the journey cost her permanently. She would later reflect that frostbite and cold she could recover from. Leaving the network behind was something she could not. After repeated detentions in Spain, Wake reached Britain in April 1943. She was processed through MI6, then trained at SOE's Beaulieu estate. Her field preparation included sabotage, wireless protocol, and explosives identification, skills she would use within months in occupied France. Wake arrived in London exhausted but unbroken. She was first debriefed at Orchard Court, the SOE's reception flat near Oxford Street. Her report on resistance cell structure in Marseille, recent Gestapo movements, and compromised routes helped update Allied assessments of southern France. Following vetting interviews, she was assigned to SOE's F section, the division responsible for deploying trained agents into occupied France to support sabotage and espionage under General de Gaulle's Free French framework. Her fluency in French, experience with false identities, and prior field record made her an immediate candidate for parachute insertion. SOE training followed a rigid curriculum. Wake joined a mixed cohort of male and female operatives at the Special Training School at Beaulieu in Hampshire, an estate commandeered and fortified for covert warfare instruction. Days began before dawn. Demolition lectures, physical conditioning, fieldcraft navigation, silent killing techniques with Fairbairn Sykes knives. Instructors took careful note of Wake's endurance and bearing, her ability to adapt under pressure, to memorize route layouts, to improvise under surveillance. When asked to memorize a map she'd seen for less than 30 seconds, she redrew it almost exactly, including trench depth and hedgerow gaps. Wireless usage was another matter. For all her discipline, Wake never fully trusted the cumbersome B-2 suitcase radios. The 8-minute broadcast rule, any transmission over 480 seconds risked triangulation by German direction-finding vans, left little margin for error. Wake trained to identify German jamming, recognize signal interference patterns, and destroy equipment with thermite if compromised. Among her instructors was Leo Marks, SOE's head of codes. Though not directly assigned to her, he later described agents like Wake as fielders in the deadliest communications game ever devised. Instructors gave agents cover identities for battlefield testing. Wake's was Mrs. Gay, a false identity she was later told suited her quick mind and unpredictability. Her performance in final exercises, shadow evasion, bomb placement, message delivery under duress, ranked among the strongest among women deployed that spring. By June 1943, she stood ready for field assignment. She wouldn't be back in London for nearly a year. When she returned, it would be as one of SOE's most decorated field agents. On the night of April 29, 1944, Nancy Wake parachuted into the forested hills near St. Santon. Misjudging the drop, she landed tangled in a tree in her silk gown. Her team included Captain Henry Tardivat and resistance leaders preparing sabotage operations north of Toulouse. The parachute drop was part of Operation Freelance, an SOE mission aimed at boosting sabotage efforts across the Auvergne region in advance of the Allied invasion. Wake traveled with two other agents, a radio operator known only as Duffer and Tardivat, a liaison tasked with coordinating the Maquis units of the Cantal and Lot departments. They were flown from RAF Tempsford aboard a Halifax bomber belonging to 138 Squadron, a unit specializing in clandestine insertions. The flight crossed France under strict radio silence. At 600 feet, the bomb bay doors opened above the drop site, a moonlit meadow designated DZ Kilo, marked with handheld torches forming a three-point triangle. Wake's personal gear included a Sten Mark II, pre-packed identity papers, a cyanide capsule, and 10 pounds of encrypted correspondence sewn into the lining of her jacket. She wore no helmet. Instead, she jumped in a white parachute and a silk gown, standard attire for female SOE agents to blend with civilian dress on landing. Her chute opened cleanly, but high wind drifted her off course, into the upper branches of an oak tree. Tardivat and a local farmer helped cut her down within minutes. Her arrival had been anticipated by regional Maquis leaders, who had received coded BBC broadcasts a day prior. The activation phrase, Le renard saute la haie, the fox jumps the hedge, was their signal to light the drop site and prepare for armed reception of supplies. Within the first hour of landing, Wake began reviewing plans for rail sabotage, munitions cache deployment, and demolition operations planned to sever German reinforcements en route from central France to Normandy. The forest around St. Santon would serve as her base. Within days, she had met with cell leaders from Montluçon and Aurillac, coordinating logistics under the alias Madame André. The wireless operator established contact with SOE base at Baker Street headquarters, confirming drop success. For Wake, the operation marked a shift from courier to command. She now held operational authority over several thousand armed Maquis fighters in one of France's most strategically critical inland regions. Working with the French resistance, known as the Maquis, Wake helped convert local cells into coordinated strike units. Armed via airdropped crates from RAF flights, these groups targeted German rail lines, supply depots, and fuel convoys ahead of D-Day. In the rural uplands of central France, the Maquis were often little more than bands of draft evaders, political dissidents, and veterans, hiding from conscription into German labor. Poorly armed and loosely organized, Many had rifles dating back to the First World War, if they had weapons at all. Wake's arrival in May 1944, backed by SOE resources and the authority to approve airdrops and direct sabotage operations, transformed fragmented units into a structured regional force. Her first task was consolidation. Dozens of local resistance groups operated independently, often unaware of each other's locations or actions. Wake, using her SOE authority and Maquis liaison Henry Tardivat's regional network, began assembling commanders in forest clearings and abandoned barns. She recalibrated priorities. No more spontaneous uprisings or assassinations that triggered brutal German reprisals. Her focus was infrastructure: bridges, tracks, supply convoys, and power lines supplying key transit corridors. Arms and explosives arrived via night drops from RAF 138 and 161 squadrons. Each crate, floated down by parachute, had to be retrieved, hidden, and inventoried. Weapons included Sten guns, Enfield rifles, PIAT anti-tank launchers, and packs of Nobel 808 plastic explosive. Wake enforced tight discipline around their use. Charges were to be used only on specified targets: rail junctions around Montluçon, fuel convoys headed north from Rodez, and telephone relays linking Vichy forces to command centers in Clermont-Ferrand. Wake introduced British-style briefing protocols. Before each operation, teams rehearsed the strike, escape routes, and pre-planned fallback points. She required updates by courier or radio on completed acts. One report, received on May 15, detailed the successful sabotage of the Kaptenack rail junction, collapsing both German troop timetables and local freight schedules for nearly 4 days. She also brought order to personnel. Dissenters, informers, and undisciplined fighters were subject to Maquis military justice, swift and sometimes brutal. But morale improved. For the first time, these rural units recognized they were part of something planned and deliberate, something that directly supported the coming Allied invasion. From the forests of Auvergne, Nancy Wake turned local defiance into operational warfare. And for the Wehrmacht, it was just beginning. While commanding sabotage raids, Wake carried explosives hidden in baskets and a Sten gun when traveling alone. She once cycled over 240 kilometers in under 72 hours to replace lost radio codes after a drop site compromise, a journey that preserved Allied air operations in the region. It began near a drop site outside Saint-Santin. The night had gone wrong. The wireless operator's kit, buried near a streambed, had been destroyed by German patrols responding to earlier sabotage. Without the encryption pads, Wake's team couldn't make secure contact with SOE's Baker Street headquarters. That meant no further arms drops, no intelligence updates, and no confirmation of D-Day support operations. In a terrain dominated by rail lines and limited radio range, weeks of plans hung in silence. Wake volunteered to ride. The nearest cache of codes, a safe set of field ciphers and reserve crystals, was over 100 miles south in Châteauroux. Maquis couriers could not be spared. Road patrols had increased after recent attacks on fuel convoys. She set out alone before dawn, dressed as a village girl on an errand, the Sten broken into sections and hidden beneath loaves of stale bread in a rear basket. Her cover, a vendor transporting goods to a sister in Figeac. The route passed through multiple departmental zones. German checkpoints lined the main highways, so Wake wound through clogged farm roads, pushed along irrigation ditches, and crossed river fords without bridges. She stopped only briefly for water or direction, never sleep. Villagers later recalled seeing a woman with a bandaged leg pedaling past gendarmes with practiced indifference. What they didn't know: under the bread sat 2 charges of Nobel 808, sewn into the lining of a canvas satchel. It took just under 72 hours. Exhausted, dehydrated, and bleeding from saddle bruises and torn shoes, Wake reached the contact point with the ciphers hidden in the false bottom of her bag. A young boy, no older than 14, returned with the signal phrase confirming retrieval. Le tonnerre vient de partir. The thunder has just left. Within 36 hours, wireless contact had been re-established across the entire sector. Airdrops resumed. Sabotage operations continued. Supply routes were updated for June deployments. Wake said little of the ride afterward, except that she preferred bicycles to radios. Radios could betray you. The steel frame and rubber tires had carried her through silence, mud, and Gestapo patrol belts. And she had not been stopped. German reports from July 1944 noted an uptick in attacks on rail lines around Montluçon. Field interviews with captured Maquis revealed consistent descriptions. A woman with an Australian accent, fluent in French, issuing orders and vanishing without a trace. Interrogation records from the Sicherheitspolizei in Vichy, compiled after repeated sabotage operations, referenced une femme étrangère seen near blast sites, observed directing men twice her age in strategic demolitions. Detainees under duress described her as sharp-eyed, blonde, always moving, never leaving a trace behind. She carried dispatch satchels, sometimes a small-caliber pistol, and spoke like someone who had lived in France for decades but didn't quite belong. The descriptions aligned too closely to ignore. A regional Reichsbahn official lodged formal complaints to the SS command in Clermont-Ferrand after no fewer than 6 derailments struck the Montluçon line in just 10 days, 2 of them involving munitions trains bound for the Atlantic fortifications near La Rochelle. Bridge girders were cut with precision, not brute force, suggesting military-grade knowledge. Explosives matched those airdropped in SOE supply canisters. When German field engineers examined the craters, they found time-delay fuses built into mine casings tucked under sleepers at predictable load points. It wasn't amateur work. On July 16, 1944, following a German sweep in the countryside near St. Flour, 4 Maquis fighters were captured. Among them was a 19-year-old radio runner carrying torn cipher fragments sewn into his socks. Under interrogation, he broke. He confirmed the presence of a female commander known as André, with authority to call in and redistribute airdrops, direct sabotage priorities, and execute collaborators. He did not know her real name, but when shown a crude sketch already circulating from Brest to Lyon, he pointed and nodded. The Gestapo's hunt intensified. Regional directives were sent to deploy additional SD patrols, intercept couriers, and profile suspects in all central and southern departments. Radio detection vans moved south from Bordeaux. Rewards were posted. 5 million francs for information leading to the arrest of the White Mouse, a codename Berlin began using formally in July. Despite the pressure Wake's network held, raids increased. Airdrops grew more precise. Entire German convoys disappeared into ravines they once commanded. Closer though they came, the Gestapo never found her. Not in the villages, not in the forests, not in the shattered rail yards she had helped bring down, one bridge at a time. Facing betrayals, Wake led a purge of compromised collaborators. One tip nearly led to her arrest in a farmhouse near Moulins. She escaped seconds before a sweep, radioing London to approve execution orders for informants later verified through false drop testing. By late July 1944, the Maquis in the Montluçon sector had grown considerably in strength and boldness, too much so for their security protocols to remain invisible. Several missions had failed without explanation. Arms caches intercepted within hours, couriers stopped between pre-cleared checkpoints, and one ambush by German units that seemed to anticipate every move. The collapse of 2 drop site operations in consecutive weeks triggered alarm. Wake suspected infiltration. The Maquis lacked the formal counterintelligence structure of the Allied forces, so Wake devised one. Working with her wireless operator and a corps of trusted commanders, she created a bait system. False drop locations, coded as Delta 3 and Fox 7, were broadcast in deceptive reports to London and intentionally leaked to suspected informants. Both sites came under German observation within 48 hours. The pattern was enough. The informants had names. In one case, a man named Morel, once a warehouse clerk turned quartermaster, was accused of alerting German patrols in exchange for food coupons and the promise of protection for a sick relative. Wake's team captured and interrogated him. His confession, taken in a barn with two Maquis officers present, confirmed that information had been passed via an innkeeper's wife operating as a local Vichy agent. Wake radioed Baker Street with the findings. Under SOE Directive 40, 5 black field commanders were authorized to sanction executions deemed essential to preserving operational integrity. The signal came back encrypted and brief, decision left to field. Within 72 hours, 2 collaborators were executed by firing squad and buried under assumed field names. No announcement, just their silence. Shortly after, an urgent warning reached Wake through a secondary courier. German agents, tipped off by unknown sources, were en route to a farmhouse she had visited the night before near Moulins. She reached the edge of the village minutes before a 6-man Gestapo patrol arrived. Uniforms, dogs, orders to search. Wake vanished into hedgerows and sewers on foot, reciting a false ID under her breath as the dogs barked behind her. That night she ordered the network halved, only essential nodes remained. Precision replaced expansion. Trust would no longer be assumed. The Gestapo was behind the curtain now, and Wake would meet them, not with papers but with sabotage and silence. In the weeks before D-Day, Wake's teams disabled dozens of train lines using plastique charges. Most of the sabotage was timed to avoid collateral damage. Trains were hit in sidings, not villages. The logistics disruption delayed German divisions sent to counter the Normandy invasion. The primary objective, assigned weeks in advance by SOE's F section, was infrastructure paralysis. With the Allied invasion expected on the northern French coast, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front was paramount. German reserves stationed in southern and central France relied on the national rail grid. Double-tracked lines branched from Clermont-Ferrand, Ussel, and Montluçon, nodes vital to moving panzer units and heavy artillery toward Normandy. Wake's Maquis units were tasked with severing those arteries. Each sabotage operation was blunt in impact but meticulous in planning. Wake insisted on unwavering attention to civilian safety. Bridges were taken out between stations. Switch points were targeted during gaps in civilian timetables, and trains were hit at sidings whenever possible to ensure locomotive crews had time to jump clear. Explosive placement followed British demolition protocol. Nobel 808 plastique packed into canvas satchels, affixed directly to rail joints or fitted under wooden sleepers with 2-minute time delay pencil detonators. Charges were pre-measured, triggered remotely where terrain allowed. By early June 1944, over 70 coordinated attacks had hit German rail lines across her operating region. One strike outside commentary lifted an entire locomotive and tender off the rails using only 8 pounds of explosive placed at a critical switch. Another, west of Montluçon, destroyed a fuel convoy carrying diesel reserves allocated to a panzer division ordered north. Wreckage blocked the track for 6 days. Wake's network reported each strike through her wireless operators, using minimal code bursts. London responded with praise but emphasized timing. The disruption had to coincide with the Normandy landings to be effective. On June 6, 1944, the day Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Wake coordinated over a dozen simultaneous cuts to lines linking Clermont-Ferrand, Brive, and Limoges. German units attempting to redeploy toward Caen were rerouted, delayed, or stranded. The Wehrmacht command recorded the sabotage in field reports now held in German military archives. The description was clinical. Widespread infrastructure attacks by well-armed guerrilla elements coordinated with Allied operations. They did not name Wake, But her timing, her reach, and her constant movement had left a signature, one measured not in names, but in days stolen from German timetables. When her primary radio operator failed to respond, Wake knew the risk was compromise. She biked through rough terrain to locate an alternate set cached in a hayloft near St. Leon. Her emergency rebroadcast re-established communications under SOE Protocol IC6C. The silence began just before midnight on June 22, 1944. Wake's radio operator, or pianist, as SOE terminology called them, was due to transmit encoded updates confirming successful rail sabotage near Montluçon and requesting a fresh drop of demolitions. When no signal was registered at Baker Street, London flagged her sector as dark. Wake waited, hoping for confirmation via secondary courier. None came. Within 48 hours, she suspected the worst: compromise, arrest, or death. Wireless operators were the most vulnerable link in any SOE cell. A single transmission over 8 minutes allowed direction-finding vans to triangulate position with deadly precision. Operators used mobile kits disguised in furniture or carts, but their signals were traceable all the same. Many operatives lasted only 6 weeks in the field. Wake's operator had already been transmitting for 10. The odds were closing in. With no confirmation of capture but no signal either, she could not risk transmitting from their usual location. Instead, she initiated Contingency Plan Foxhall, a fallback communication effort requiring physical relocation to a secondary set hidden 50 kilometers south in the loft of a shuttered grain barn near St. Leon. Accessible only by loose cart track and 2 river crossings, the route was no courier job. Wake pedaled it herself, armed with a sten on a shoulder strap, forged ration books, and the full weight of her network's survival inside a bundle of pre-coded messages. The journey took her over 14 hours. She avoided the towns, moving through orchards, fences, and ridgelines. When she arrived at the barn near dusk, the transmitter was still buried beneath sacking and straw. She reassembled the B2 set by hand, rigged the long wire aerial out the hayloft vent, and began transmitting under SOE fallback protocol IC6C, a failsafe burst pattern used when primary pianists were lost. Code phrases confirmed her identity. London replied in less than 5 minutes. The impact was immediate. Airdrops were rescheduled, sabotage coordination resumed, and London acknowledged the assumed loss of her original operator. Wake never received word of his fate. His name was struck from field logs, his last signal listed as null. But the network lived, reborn through a hayloft, a bicycle, and the frequency of resistance. A joint Abwehr SS detachment set a roadblock in late August 1944 based on decoded courier information. Wake was meant to pass through 20 minutes later. Change in route due to a sheep cart, unusual even for her, spared her life, and the final convoy codebook. The planned route followed a narrow road that wound through a limestone gorge east of Saint-Céré, one of the few reliable passages between Wake's northern Maquis sector and a critical drop zone in the Lot Valley. The courier route had been secure for weeks. Coded convoy timetables and demolition schedules for a planned attack on a German rail depot at Aurillac were written in cipher, carried in Wake's breast pocket, and due to be delivered to a liaison station by dusk. What Wake could not have known: a courier arrested days earlier had broken under extreme pressure during an Abwehr-led interrogation. His last known message referenced upcoming movements in the gorge. German counterintelligence, working with elements of the SS based near Figeac, established a roadblock disguised as a standard Wehrmacht fuel inspection point. Soldiers wore regular Panzergrenadier uniforms. The civilian signage was maintained. The intent was surgical: intercept a high-level resistance courier whose value exceeded any rank. Wake, however, had changed her route at the last moment. While leaving the Hilton of Saucirac that morning, her path was blocked by a slow-moving shepherd and flock forcing her bike off the main road. Impatient but cautious, She opted for an alternative route through a back valley, adding nearly an hour to her planned schedule. As she later recalled in debriefs, the detour was minor, even frustrating, but the kind of randomness that sometimes drew the line between survival and disappearance. At 16:50 hours, German units intercepted a Maquis courier passing through the planned ambush point. He carried spare parts for a radio set, nothing of strategic value. Still, he was taken. Wake remained unaware of just how close the net had drawn, but she completed the delivery 6 hours later, arriving after dark and soaking wet from a midsummer storm that overtook the highlands. The convoy codebook survived. The attack on the Aurillac depot went ahead on August 31. German trains were disabled, munitions destroyed. Wake never saw the gorge road again. The sheep cart that delayed her, its driver unknown, never appeared in any resistance file. But on one road under one sun, it altered the course of the war, if only slightly. By September 1944, most of south-central France had been liberated. Nancy Wake's operations had disrupted nearly 5,000 German troop movements and destroyed dozens of armored vehicles. Her husband, Henry Fiacca, was not among the returning. He had been executed months earlier by the Gestapo in Marseille for refusing to betray her. The retreating Wehrmacht, under constant pressure from Allied air power and resistance ambushes, withdrew from key posts in Auvergne and the Lot Valley throughout August and early September. German transit records, captured in Clermont-Ferrand following the city's liberation, revealed weeks of infrastructure collapse, cut rail spurs, fuel convoys intercepted, command units severed from supply. Wake's Maquis groups had held choke points, blocked reinforcements, and, according to SOE summaries, inflicted combat disruption unimaginable a year earlier. With towns returning to free French control, Wake and her team transitioned from active sabotage to stabilization. Her field radio sent final acknowledgments to Baker Street, confirming liberation at Saint-Santin and cessation of operations at multiple drop zones. Weapons were hidden, caches buried, codes burned. In liberated villages, crowds welcomed resistance figures with bread, cider, and the ringing of church bells unused since 1940. But one message never came. Wake had sent word to Marseille weeks earlier through secondary contacts, asking for news about Henry Fiacca, her husband since 1939, whom she had not seen since fleeing France in late 1942. Their apartment on Rue Grignon had been raided in early 1943. Henry had remained behind, believing his business connections and neutral image would mask Nancy's flight. According to information gathered by Free French investigators, he was arrested by the Gestapo shortly after her escape. He was held for months, questioned, moved between holding centers, and finally executed in mid-1943. He gave up nothing. His name never appeared in German testimonies, nor in post-war informant reports. Only a notice in a Gestapo logbook confirmed the execution. Date unknown, justification, coordination with enemy agent. Wake received confirmation from Vichy police fringes. One former clerk, still wearing civilian shoes to avoid retribution, handed her a piece of torn file, a page stamped with Henry's name and Verloren-Nack Rookfridge, lost after further inquiry. There was no grave, no last letter, just silence and a war that by then had already moved north. For Nancy Wake, France was free, but the part of it that mattered most did not survive. Returning to London, Wake demanded reinstatement into operational briefings. She later testified in post-war trials regarding Vichy collaboration, citing names she memorized under duress. Her reports became part of confidential appendices now held at Kew National Archives. Wake's debriefing began in October 1944 at Orchard Court, SOE's London HQ for returning agents. Unlike most operatives, she didn't return under quiet orders. Still in field uniform, she arrived with a courier pouch containing handwritten post-action analyses, field inventories of airdrop materiel, and the names of both collaborators and resistance fighters. Decisive intelligence for Allied occupation planners. Her testimony, delivered fluently without notes across several sessions, was regarded by British officers as among the most detailed first-hand records of Central French operations. She identified over 24 individuals by full name, including Vichy officials, innkeepers, and couriers who had, under interrogation or willingly, transmitted Maquis movements to the Gestapo or Abwehr. Some names were cross-referenced months later in captured German files and confirmed. Others were quietly added to blacklists passed from SOE to the French Provisional Government's Comité d'Épuration, a body tasked with the legal purging of wartime collaborators. Wake's memory of names and addresses under pressure was exceptional. She had practiced recall drills during training at Beaulieu, but had rarely relied on notes in the field. Much of what she now gave, in daily briefings lasting up to 6 hours, formed the core of SOE Summary Vector 7F, a restricted post-war intelligence document that remains partially redacted in the Q archives. But her testimony did not stop with collaborators. She also lobbied forcefully for recognition of local French Maquis. Names like Henry Tardivat, Jean Morel, and members of the groupement Veni appear in her briefings, credited with sabotage missions that delayed German troop transfers during the D-Day window. Her voice carried weight, not only as a decorated agent, but as the rare surviving commander who could still speak for those who didn't return. In a trial held in Marseille in 1945, Wake appeared as a formal witness. Wearing British insignia, she testified against a former Vichy police inspector, accused of handing resistance suspects to the SS in exchange for property guarantees. He denied her account until confronted with markings from one of his own ledgers, pages Wake had memorized, line by line, in a Marseille attic waiting for arrest that never came. With the war's end in sight, Wake no longer carried a gun or radio, but her words, now under oath, unlocked a different kind of justice. Wake was one of the most decorated servicewomen of the war. France awarded her the Croix de Guerre with Palm, Britain offered the George Medal, and the United States later recognized her role in Allied planning. Still, she rarely discussed her operations until decades later. The formal citations acknowledged courage under fire, outstanding coordination of sabotage missions, and direct contribution to the liberation of occupied territories. In France, General de Gaulle personally approved her Croix de Guerre with 2 bronze stars and the Palm, awarded for acts of heroism in combat. A second ceremony in London added the George Medal, granted through the Royal Warrant for civilian bravery during armed conflict. The wording was clinical, for service in connection with operations carried out in conditions of exceptional danger. But outside the citations, much remained classified. Wake's most effective operations, codebooks, personnel who never resurfaced, secured sabotage points still undisclosed, were never detailed publicly. British records from SOE's F section were sealed under the Official Secrets Act until the 1970s. It wasn't until later, when researchers accessed fragments of the Baker Street archives, that references to her field operations under the code name Haline appeared regularly. Even then, Wake's own recounting of her wartime work was understated. When approached about interviews in the post-war years, she often deflected, attributing success to luck and the bravery of the Maquisards. In a 1956 broadcast, she described her most difficult moment not as an ambush or sabotage strike, but the interrogation of an informant whose betrayal had cost 5 lives. She refused to speak publicly about the outcome. Australia lagged behind in acknowledgments. For years, her home country failed to issue any decoration, citing questions about the technical scope of her service. Only in 2004, at age 91, did she receive the Companion of the Order of Australia, AC, for service to international relations. Wake's reaction was brief and characteristically direct. They could have bloody well given it to me earlier. Her foreign medals, 6 in total, were kept in a shoebox beneath her bed in London. She refused to wear them publicly except once, for a memorial in France, where she walked alone to a small stone marker near St. Santon, just above the field where she had landed by parachute in silk and mud. For all the awards, Wake never sought titles, speeches, or ceremonies. The fight had never been about recognition. It had simply been about winning. In the post-war decades, Wake's story was occasionally romanticized, simplified, or doubted, especially by those unaware of the rigor in her SOE files. Some books exaggerated kills, others omitted operations. But her coded reports, decrypted in the 1970s and 1980s, matched field outcomes with uncanny precision. The myths emerged in parallel with the record. As early as the 1950s, Wake's name began to appear in serialized war magazines across Britain and Australia. Headlines called her the flaming-haired saboteur, White Mouse of France, and Lady Spy who killed for freedom. These accounts, often written without access to classified British intel, shaped her legacy into one of bullet-dodging spectacle, an image Wake herself rejected. In private, she referred to the flashier portrayals as nonsense made for Sunday readers. The truth was more methodical. With the partial declassification of F-section operational logs in the 1970s, historians gained access to encoded field traffic Wake transmitted, many under variant call signs referable to Operation Freelance, and its subsequent extensions in the Rhone corridors. These messages aligned with contemporaneous RAF airdrop records, German rail damage assessments, and Allied post-action summaries. Even her much-questioned 240-kilometer bicycle ride, recounted in early memoirs as a 3-day sprint to retrieve lost codes, was corroborated via decoded transmission relays noting the signal gap in that exact window, and the sudden restoration from the fallback station Wake mentioned. Field records confirmed not just the operations themselves, but her leadership over independent sabotage groups, chain of command authority to authorize executions of collaborators under SOE Directive 45, and her mobility across departments during the most volatile stretch of 1944. Critics citing improbability based on gender or assumptions of auxiliary roles were proven wrong by document trails that linked code words to results. Lines blown, bridges dropped, trains derailed. Still, accuracy competed with narrative. Wake's own autobiography, published late in life, blended candor with omissions. She left out names, some still classified at the time, while downplaying dangers she had clearly documented in field reports. News segments made her a rogue operator. In truth, she was integrated into one of the most structured Allied espionage networks of the war. Memory reshaped her silhouette. But the ground-level facts, embossed in cable logs, sideline dispatches, and cross-batched source reports from Britain, France, and Germany, testified with greater precision. What she did could be verified. What she survived, less so. Nancy Wake lived out her final decades in relative privacy. In 2001, she chose to return to London. She died in 2011. Her ashes were scattered in central France at the site of her 1944 drop zone. That land once received code word messages and agents. Now it holds the silence of history remembered. She never fully settled into civilian life. Friends noted that Wake refused to soften. She drank whiskey, kept military hours, and dismissed political correctness as peacetime indulgence. Public recognition came slowly, and without apology. For decades, few outside wartime intelligence circles knew the extent of her operational command. A generation raised on novels and films learned only the outline. A resistance heroine who had evaded the Gestapo and helped liberate France. The archived truth, stored in faded type beneath layers of dust and encryption, spoke louder than any dramatization. Before her death, Wake made one final request: that her remains be returned to the soil of France, specifically to the hillside near St. Santon where, in April 1944, she dropped under moonlight into the hands of Maquis fighters. Decades earlier, she had referred to it as my real beginning. In 2011, that wish was fulfilled. French officials attended a small, private ceremony. A few surviving Maquisards gathered at the edge of the cliff. There were no speeches, just soil, folded flags, and silence. The location, once coded as DZ Kilo in SOE signal traffic, remains unchanged in topography but transformed in function. The clearings that had once blazed with signal torches beneath RAF Halifaxes are now quiet meadows. Sheep graze near twisted remnants of rail lines that no longer carry troops. Beneath the surface, fragments remain. Rusted canisters, shattered wireless valves, the occasional shell casing unearthed after storms. Among the last to speak her name in uniform was the mayor of a nearby town. He referred to her not as spy or saboteur, but as la dernière combattante, the last woman of the fight. In a war where so many left no trace, she had left signals, orders, and craters. Few now recognize the codes that once summoned storms in that region. But in London archives, French field reports, and the gravel beneath Saint Santon, her network holds. The signals silent, the mission complete.